Very good. I appreciate everyone's patience. Today uh, is the Iowa State University Extension Dairy Team webinar series. We're focusing on saving energy on your farm. We're tickled to have uh, Joel Zook from Winneshiek Energy District to discuss energy saving measures. He'll cover a lot of the common practices from lighting to equipment, but especially focus on opportunities that exist through NRCS's EQIP and REAP programs. Uh, Folks, if you will, when you're listening, keep your mic muted. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions by typing in the chat box, or if we have a small group, we'll go ahead and just open the mics up and ask questions as we go. Joel, the podium is yours.
All right. Thank you, Fred. Thank you to Brian as well for getting me on the invite here, and glad to be here and talk about saving energy on your farm. Like I mentioned too, that we'll talk about both energy efficiency and renewable energy today. These are both really good options, and of course complementary pieces that can help save some real dollars. So I work for the Winneshiek Energy District in Winneshiek County up in the northeast corner of Iowa. And we do a lot of work with both homeowners and business owners and farms as well on saving energy. And our whole kind of reason for being is that we want to save energy and dollars because that's money that we won't have to spend that leaves our communities and leaves our states. So if you can save energy, if you can produce energy yourself on your farm, that's more dollars in your pocketbook and more dollars in the local economy. So today, just a brief overview of what we're going to go over. We're going to look at the practices you can do and then how to help pay for them. So we'll look at lighting, review how we can make more efficient milk harvesting and cooling, quick look at space heating and water heating. I mentioned the grain dryers, and then solar photovoltaic. So that's solar PV or solar electric. Big funding sources that we'll talk about are EQIP through NRCS, REAP. Many people have probably heard about a REAP grant, and then tax incentives that are available for solar. I've got this here at the first, lighting. Lighting is huge. Please don't forget it because I mentioned it first. Maybe I'll try to remember to bring it up at the end again. Lighting is certainly one of the very most cost-effective practices that almost any farm or business can make. LEDs can drop the lighting usage in half compared to probably most of the fixtures you have, and LED replacements are pretty quick and easy to do a one-for-one replacement, and that could be anything from if you've got big old metal halide lights in your barn or any of your buildings. If you have fluorescent lights, LEDs are going to use roughly half the amount of energy to provide the same amount of light. So that makes them incredibly cost effective even before considering rebates. The costs on the equipment have really come down in recent years. And so it's a very, very good practice. And it's oftentimes the first thing that I'm going to recommend when I'm walking through a farm. With the incentives though, I just will say that the EQIP, the cost share for lighting is very good. Utility incentives are not as good as they used to be, but those two do stack together. So you're allowed to take your cost share from EQIP as well as any rebates that your utility might have available to you. And I've certainly run some numbers for people where looking at the cost share and the rebates combined, they're getting projects that are almost entirely paid for. And again, this is a way to save sometimes thousands of dollars on your electric bill, which is a great way. It's a pretty painless way that doesn't need to change your operation because they are a one-for-one swap out most of the time. Just an example of this, it's fairly common still to see some of the big 400 watt metal halide high bay lights out there. So sort of like what you saw in the gym. And you can replace them with a 200 watt LED fixture. So that saves 200 watts. A lot of times in freestall barns or in parlors, those lighting are going to be running 18 hours a day. So each of those fixtures are going to save 1,300 kilowatt hours per year. It's about $184 at 14 cents per kilowatt hour. So, how many fixtures of those do you have in your barn? And, just as an example, if you've got 40 of those fixtures, again, assuming they're on 18 hours a day, which is high, that's a savings of over $7,000 per year. So you can expect less than a 2-year payback in this example before counting any incentives at all. And I will just say that, both with the way that Equip works, but just in terms of practicality, I recommend placing all your lights with LEDs. When I'm doing an energy audit on a farm, I'm typically taking inventory of all the lights they have there, and I'm saying, yeah, even change out this light here, in your calf shed that's on a few hours a day, because you can just swap everything out. You can have all new fixtures. And the way Equip works is that they give you cost incentives for each fixture or lamp you replace. And they like you to have a big list of all the energy using pieces in the thing. So that's all laid out in a report if you do a report for Equip. And they'll allow cost share as long as the entire lighting practice as a whole is cost effective. So they will give you cost share for some less cost effective individual measures as long as you've got big energy savings on the lighting practice as a whole to balance that out. So just consider changing out all your lights. It's a great way to save some dollars, fairly cheap to do in the grand scheme of things, and the payback is very quick. So things get a little bit more complicated when we're talking about cooling and milk harvesting. There's a lot of these practices that will interact with each other. For example, you might be spending a lot of energy on cooling your milk. And so replacing your compressor with a new, more efficient compressor could save a lot of money. But it won't save as much money as it would on its own if you also replace or upgrade your plate cooler so that milk is cooler in the first place. So all of these things are kind of working together, and this is why energy audits at dairies can get kind of complicated. I do charge, when I'm doing that, it's just as a reflection of how much time it takes to walk through more for a dairy energy audit than even a farm of a considerable size. So we'll talk today about plate coolers, the pump on your milk pump, talking about putting a variable speed on that pump, the vacuum pump, and putting a variable speed on that, refrigeration heat recovery units, and the compressors, looking at those replacements. So here's just a nice diagram. The very simplest thing, the milk is coming from the cow. It's getting pumped there by the vacuum pump, and then the milk pump is pumping that into the bulk tank. The refrigeration compressor is cooling that down. So not a very efficient system, but a very simple one. Where are our opportunities here? We're taking milk that's 100 degrees, more or less, and we're trying to cool that down to 40 or 35, however you want your bulk tank at, using only the compressor. And that can take a long time. So that milk is warm for a long time. You want that milk to cool down as quickly as you can. This is probably not the best setup. Not that many farms I'm running into have a system that's as simple anymore, but just telling you that, this is a stripped down version of the basics and kind of what I think about it, conceptually, where you're starting before you start to add more complications. So of course, the first thing, and in terms of this milk handling and cooling system that is going to be a recommendation, the most cost effective and quite frankly, a practice that I would say probably 90% at least of farms have, is a plate cooler. So, that it's a heat exchanger that's set up to transfer heat from the warm milk and transferring that to your cool well water. So you're bringing well water in through one side and milk through the other side. The well water leaves warm, the milk leaves cooled down. So it can cool the milk down before it enters the bulk tank down to 70 or 75 degrees. And obviously that puts a huge lift, lessens the load on your compressor, and typically can save 40 to 50% on cooling costs. And this is a fairly simple practice, right? We're just, inside this plate cooler, the milk is just passing the water, and really you're getting kind of a free cooling out of that because you're using well water that you would have had to pump anyways, using that to cool down the milk. So we mentioned that this reduces the runtime of the refrigeration system. Obviously that's going to save energy, but that can also extend the life of the system. And in that it's getting your milk cooled down much more quickly than having it sit in your bulk tank. It can increase your milk quality as well. A lot of folks will save this water in a tank that they use for either spraying down the parlor or cleaning in general, or will go to the livestock tanks. So here's this process, just showing that we're getting that milk through the plate cooler and it's entering the bulk tank a little bit cooler than it would have otherwise. Maybe not less common practice, and this is something that I'm looking at a lot and looking for the opportunities out there, is that if you get a variable speed drive on the milk pump, that will slow the flow of milk through the plate cooler. A lot of times those pumps, well, if they don't have a variable speed drive, they're just a single speed, right? So you've got a kind of a receiver jar in your parlor that's filling up with milk, and then when it hits a certain point, the milk pump turns on, pushes it through, and then it turns off when it shuts. And so that can be cycling on and off. What a variable speed drive will do is sense how much milk is there, and it will put the milk through the plate cooler much more slowly. So it'll put it through more slowly over a more even period of time. That allows more water to pass through the same sized plate cooler in comparison to the amount of milk that's walking through that. So typically on a regular plate cooler, you're passing the same amount of gallons as water as you are milk. And that's how you're getting that milk cooled down to 70 degrees. With a VSD that's in a plate that's properly sized, you're getting about triple the amount of water passing through that plate cooler as you are as the milk. And so that can cool the milk within 4 to 5 degrees of your well water temperature. So depending on exactly on your well water temperature, that's again, you're getting down to 60 degrees or lower. And again, this will make your compressor have to run a whole lot less. So there is some electric savings from running the pump at lower speeds. But most of the savings is just getting that better free cooling of the milk from your well water and the lower refrigeration times that results as part of that. Okay, so here we've got the VSD, the variable speed drive on the milk pump. And we can see that our plate cooler is doing a much heavier lift. So our bulk tank and the compressor starts out cooler. The compressor doesn't have to work as much. Okay, and I'm going to add a whole other bunch of practices here at the end. These kind of all interact with each other. But another thing that is a really good thing to be looking at is a refrigeration heat recovery unit. So there's a couple brand names out there. Some of you might call these a free heater. Thermistor is a manufacturer that makes these. What it's doing is it is taking, running your refrigerant line through a water tank. And so it's taking that hot fluid from the compressor and it is preheating domestic water, hot water that you're using. So this saves energy in 2 ways. Again, you are cooling down that fluid from your compressor, and so your compressors are not going to have to work as hard. And because they're giving all that heat up to the water tank, they are going to run a little bit more efficiently. The big part of the savings though is going to come from the fact that this is actually going to preheat your water. So you basically set these tanks up in series with your regular water heater. And so from your water heater, instead of taking your groundwater temperature and heating that up to 160, 180, however hot water you need to be washing your lines, this refrigeration heat recovery unit can bring that water up to 110, maybe 120 degrees. And the water heater will take care of the rest. Typically, these are sized to equal the volume of one washing cycle. So you're basically running that compressor at the end of milking, and that is going to take over those 12 or 8 hours, depending on how often you're milking. You're going to reject that heat to your heat recovery unit, and that will generally sized to be emptied and refilled with well water at the wash cycle at the end of your milking. So another thing to consider, and this is actually kind of on its own thing. It's less connected to everything else as opposed to that, but as a variable speed on the vacuum pump. So your vacuum pump is creating a negative pressure in your pipeline, and generally what they have is sort of a valve that keeps things from creating too much of a negative pressure. So, but the motor only has one speed, and so I like to compare this. This is like driving down the highway. You put a brick on your gas pedal, and you use your foot on the brake to control the speed. It's not very efficient. So putting a variable speed vacuum pump will modulate that motor up and down to get you the vacuum suction that you need without creating more suction than you need and having to introduce air to that system. So just a quick thing to note on that is that, you know, a variable speed does need a three-phase power. You can either do that with three-phase power if you have that at your farm, or you can use a converter. Just need to be aware of that extra expense if you have single phase. It's not worth adding three-phase to your farm simply for the variable speed on the vacuum pump. The converter is much cheaper than that, but just knowing that, you know, when you're talking about cost there, it's going to be a different cost for you, maybe your neighbor with three-phase, than it is for you with a single phase. And generally also you're looking at replacing the pump at the same times. The old rotary vane don't accept a VSD and as well as the new ones, Globe styles do. Okay, and last of all, so a compressor, right? So a compressor, you know, typically a lot of times there still are seeing a lot of reciprocating compressors out there. They're older, they're more common usually, and they're less efficient. They're sort of an oval shape when viewed from above. That's kind of how to check them out. A scroll compressor is newer. They use 15 to 20% less energy. There's fewer moving parts in them, and they have a sort of circular shape from above. So I typically am not recommending compressor replacement before this equipment has ended its useful life. A lot of times the savings can be pretty marginal unless you're a very large dairy. But it always makes sense to be putting in a new scroll compressor if you're looking at replacing a compressor already. So this is how that system all looks together. We can see it gets sort of complicated. And just one of the things, I mentioned this before, but you know, the reasons that dairy energy audits can be confusing and a little complicated is calculating your energy savings from replacing your compressor is going to be dependent on a lot of things. You know, it's how much work is that compressor actually doing. That may depend on the size and the ability of your plate cooler and whether you have a variable speed drive on the milk pump going into it. And also whether you have a free heater or a refrigeration heat recovery unit inside that at all. So these all are interacting together. That's why dairies can be a little bit complicated. But this is maybe the system that you want to be looking at going towards. Like I said, you know, a lot of times most people have plate coolers already. VSDs on the milk pumps make sense for, I think, almost any dairy. Depending on how big your parlor is going to affect whether putting a variable speed drive on your vacuum pump, and also just how old is your vacuum pump. If you've got a brand new vacuum pump that's not compatible with a VSD, you may want to be waiting on that replacement. If you've got one that can accept it, your upfront cost from adding that VSD is much lower, and so you might want to consider it. So these all things get teased out in an energy audit, and which is where I recommend most people are starting. I just wanted to make a quick mention here too of grain drying. Not a ton of dairies are making a slam dunk case to replace the grain dryer, but it's something that I'll always consider. Typically, you want to see 50, really 100,000 bushels of corn dried per year before you know that grain dryer is going to score well on incentives from Equip or from REAP. So maybe $100,000 is that sweet spot, but it's certainly worth getting it, running the numbers for your farm and your operation when you're looking at getting energy audit as besides. You know, a new grain dryer can certainly save 20 to 30% of your LP costs that you're using for grain drying compared to how old your system is. So that's certainly worth looking into. Water heating, of course, we mentioned that water heating is important. You guys need that to keep your lines clean. We mentioned the refrigeration heat recovery unit that can do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of making that well water up to 110, 120 degrees. Your water heater can take care of the rest. Generally, I'm not going to recommend a replacement water heater unless you've got a very old, inefficient water heater, but you do want to look at a condensing unit to replace your water heater at the end of its lifespan. I guess the only exception I'll make to that is if for some reason you have an electric hot water heater, it probably does make a lot of sense. Using electricity to heat your water is an expensive way to go. So being able to look at a condensing LP or gas unit certainly could have some significant savings for you. And space heating. A lot of dairies are not using a ton of space heating, especially in the barn. If you're heating the barn, you really should probably be looking at better insulation. But a lot of farms, have a heated machine shed. Dairies, of course, generally have a heated parlor. So choosing an efficient heater, either a radiant tube style heater or a condensing furnace, is going to save money over your LB white heater that you've got hung up in the corner. And there are cost share available for space heating equipment as well. We'll talk a little bit about funding sources. I've kind of saved solar PV to the end because it kind of stands on its own for the most part. So where you need to be aware of is if you're looking at getting an energy audit and you want to make energy upgrades on your farm, I think if you have time, the first folks you should talk to always is your folks at the NRCS office, your Soil and Water Conservation District. NRCS runs the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's the same program that you may have or used or seen your neighbors use for terraces or cover crops or many, many, many other practices, but they do have an on-farm energy incentive program within EQIP, and it can cost share both the cost of an energy audit and also the cost of the practices, the upgrades that you make. So there is cost share for lighting. There is cost share for building envelope improvements. So either insulation or sealing your building to make it more airtight. There is cost share for all of the dairy equipment that we mentioned, or heat recovery heat unit, water heating, space heating, scroll compressors, variable speed drives for milk pumps or vacuum pumps. And I don't know if I'm forgetting anything, but if I mentioned it before, it is covered in EQIP's cost share. Now, EQIP is a little bit different in saying that, they're only going to cost share and you're only going to score well when you're proposing practices that will pay for themselves on their own before incentives. So if you're expecting that your lighting has a 10-year lifespan, you need to show that your lighting has a payback of less than 10 years. That's an easy example. Lighting almost always has a payback of less than 10 years. But it does make things sometimes more marginal when you're looking at maybe putting in a heat recovery heat unit on a relatively smaller dairy. Sometimes they don't make the cut, but they do like you to get an energy audit and be evaluating all of the energy usage on the farm, taking a look at the big picture, and applying for multiple practices at a time. So as far as EQIP goes, I will say, that it does take some time to do. It's not a good program to work if you've got an emergency replacement of your compressor. And that is why I'd recommend that even if you're not thinking immediately about energy efficiency improvements, you should talk to NRCS now about signing up for cost share, getting an energy audit, and having that on the books, so that anytime that you're looking at a replacement or just getting an evaluation of where can I save some dollars on my operating expenses. One point I will note is that EQIP has cost share for practices that are energy efficiency only. It is only focused on reducing energy usage on the farm. It does not have any cost share or incentives for renewable energy. REAP is another USDA program, Rural Energy for America program. I'm sure that many of you have heard of someone that you know getting a REAP grant for various things. REAP grants can cover either energy efficiency or renewable energy, or both. I've definitely seen some combination applications and grants get approved. And the one thing to note is that you cannot take REAP and EQIP at the same time. A lot of people will apply for both to kind of double their chances at getting approved at one or the other, but you've got to pick one. You can't match them with each other. You can, however, match REAP with any tax incentives that are available for solar, and we'll talk about those later in the solar section. So just a little bit more on energy assessments themselves. NRCS does provide significant cost share for on-farm energy improvements, as well as the audits. And so I mentioned all those practices before and mentioned that it is available for the energy assessment itself. I recommend that you talk to your NRCS office now and sign up for an energy audit. You can get EQIP dollars to pay for an energy audit. If you do that now, you will be in line for their fall deadline. Generally, the fall deadline is inconveniently in the middle of harvest, and then they make awards around January or the end of the year. And they still do have 2 funding cycles, but it's become more and more competitive. The big dollars go out in the fall. The leftovers get distributed in the spring. So if you're looking at upgrading practices, your best chances are to sign up in the fall. So get in touch with them now. If there's projects that you're considering, get in touch with them anyway, even if you just want to sign up for an energy audit and be able to apply for cost share on that so that you can make improvements and get the energy assessment done kind of on your own leisurely time. I just will mention that the EQIP is not a great practice, a great program for emergency replacement of equipment. The big thing is that you need to apply and be approved for equipment before you can make a purchase. So even if you apply for EQIP and that you haven't heard that you've been awarded something, if you have to replace a compressor because one went down on you, it might be a scroll compressor that meets the criteria of the program, but if you paid for that or put it in before you were awarded your EQIP cost share, you're not eligible for it. So that's just a program rule. And talk with the folks at NRCS. They know the programs inside and out, and they will help you navigate them. Just another quick note on the energy audit. You need an energy audit of some sort in order to apply for REAP or EQIP. REAP is a little bit more lenient on what they call and allow as an energy audit. EQIP has higher standards, more stipulations, I'll say. And I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to say you can apply for both REAP and EQIP, but you can only use one funding source. You can't use both. So I know that I've worked with folks in the past who have applied for both REAP and EQIP on a grain dryer. They felt that just doing both was a good way to kind of hedge their bets. The program guidelines are a little bit different for both, and if you get approved for both, you can pick which one works best for you. But you can't use them to match each other. Okay. So beyond energy efficiency, we're going to talk about solar, and today at least, we're going to talk about solar photovoltaic or solar PV that makes electricity. So solar electric. We're not talking about solar hot water for space or water heating. And I will just mention that real quickly that, there's a lot of moving parts in solar hot water, and a lot of times I think you can get the system done more simply and efficiently by just using LP and an efficient system there. Solar hot water, especially for dairies use a lot of hot water, obviously, but if you run back all the way to those slides before where I was showing you how those systems interact with each other, by the time you have a refrigeration heat recovery unit, your payback for your solar hot water will be less, just simply because your heating needs are less. And you're almost always going to need to have some sort of a gas backup system anyways, because you're going to have a few days that go without sun. And so I know that folks have done some solar hot water. It looked promising at the time, but I think that your money is going to be more safely spent on the solar electric side of things. So one last reminder, I know that people, before we get to running off into solar and making your own energy, I just remind people to look at doing energy efficiency first, because it is almost always cheaper to save energy than it is to produce it yourself. It's not always the case. There's certainly to a point where you can get to diminishing returns with energy efficiency. You've done all the things you can to make your buildings and your farm as efficient as possible. Solar is the next logical step. You do want to consider any possible efficiency improvements that you've made when sizing your solar system. A lot of times the incentives are out there for you to make as much, but not more, energy from your solar that you use on your farm. So if you have a big opportunity from savings from lighting, you probably want to do that first and see how that reflects your actual energy usage before you put in the solar, because you don't want to generally size your system, your solar, for more energy than you actually need. And just another way to say this is that, a lot of times folks will come to me and they'll say, I want to make 100% of my energy with solar, and that is a laudable goal. The incentives are set up for you to do it that right, but it's very possible that you could spend $50,000 to $100,000 on solar, where if you change out your lightings first and bring your energy usage down by 10 or 20%, you could drop the cost of the solar system, still meet 100% of your needs with solar, but be spending less money overall, because that lighting was a cheaper way to get that savings for you than the solar was. So you want to make sure you take care of those energy efficiency things first. You want to work your way up your payback ladder. Do the things that pay for themselves very quickly first before you move up. Solar, just in a rough, is going to be a 7 to 10 year payback for most farms. Do that lighting first, because it's in a 2-year payback or less. So, a very important question to ask yourself when you're considering solar is, what is my utility's solar policy? Are they going to pay you for energy that you produce? We'll talk a little bit more about net metering and what that is exactly, but that is the best policy out there for you owning your own solar, is that if you put energy back on the grid, your utility will give you full retail rate for it. So if you're paying 12 or 16 cents per kilowatt hour, any energy that you produce and don't use immediately on your farm is paid back at that same rate. If they don't offer net metering, what is their buyback rate? Many utilities will offer a very low buyback rate. And so generally, a lot of them are offering wholesale power costs, 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. It's not that cheap to put up solar on your own farm. And so generally, you're trying to avoid selling energy back to your utility at their very low buyback rate. Another question to ask yourself, though, especially if there's not net metering, is what is the cost of electricity? So whether you're net metering or not, you need to know what your cost of electricity is and what is your actual energy cost of electricity. Solar is very good at producing energy. It may or may not help you reduce your demand charge. So especially if you're a larger dairy, depending on your utility, you may have a demand charge. Solar can line up and reduce your demand charge, or it may not help there at all. So look at what your cost per kilowatt hour is. It could be anything from 6 to 16 cents. And obviously that will affect your payback of your solar. If net metering is not an option, are you able to use it yourself? Can you size a system so that you make sure that you're not actually selling any energy back to the utility at that low avoided cost rate? You'd much likely be able to pay for that system more quickly if you're able to use that energy yourself, paying a higher rate. offsetting your higher retail rate. So again, net metering, many utilities offer some sort of net metering. What net metering does is give you, the solar owner, full retail value for energy that you export to the grid. And so if you are making solar energy, first that goes into your building and it offsets any energy that you're using. But if you're making more energy than your farm is using at the time, it's going to go back out onto the grid, and it's going to go and feed and power your neighbors' homes and businesses. So what a full net metering is basically you're getting an equal kilowatt hour credit for anything that you send out there. Many utilities have sort of an adopted, an adjusted part of net metering where they will let you net meter and they will give you that full credit. But at the end of the year, if you have any energy left on your balance, they will take that from you. So it's very important to know your solar policy. When you're talking with your solar contractor, make sure that they are clear on what your utility policies are. So I'll just give you an example of how this can really affect how a project looks. I was talking with folks at NICC, Northeast Iowa Community College here at the Iowa Dairy Center in Calmer. Their utility, My Energy, allows full net metering, so they can produce as much energy as they want, and they can send it back to the grid, and they can roll it over from month to month, and even year to year. There's no limit, except that My Energy says you can only put up a 40 kW solar system. So maybe that's 80 or so panels. Anything bigger than that, you're on your own. You're not allowed to net meter, and we'll buy it back from you at a low buyback price. So they're weighing their options, but I gave them 3 scenarios. This could be their most economical solutions, just to size the system to meet this cap. They're a little disappointed at how small that would be, because it would only provide about 20% of their energy usage. But it would be a very quick payback. That's, talking about a system that might cost $80,000, paying itself back in 5 or 6 years. That's quite a return on the investment. Another thing that they consider would be installing a larger system and sizing it so that it reduced their peak loads. So this takes a little bit more analysis, and they'll need to study their usage patterns to see how large this could be. But they want to know, at noon, how much energy are they using every day? Because if they are using 50 or 100 kilowatt at that time, they do 3 milkings, so their energy usage is pretty high and constant throughout the day. It's very possible that they could put in 70 or 100 kW of solar. So maybe 300 or 400 solar panels. And this could offset half their energy usage. And even though it wouldn't be net metering, they still would be offsetting their full retail value, because they were sizing that system so that it never or almost never sent energy back to the grid, where they were only getting a couple cents for it. They were going to be able to size this system, in theory, to offset their energy usage that they're actually using. And they're paying 14, 15 cents a kilowatt hour for that energy. So that does show a very good payback. And then a third scenario, which is maybe not the greatest from an economic standpoint, but they're looking at becoming a net zero energy facility. They could install a system to meet 100% of their annual needs, and it would be about 270 kW. Pretty poor payback on this system. They'd be selling a lot of energy back to their REC at only 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So I included this example of these 3 things, is that actually this is kind of a comparison to what you might be looking at depending on what your utility's net metering policy is. If you need to be in touch with folks about what that is, I would actually ask your contractor first. If your contractor knows, it probably means that they know what they're talking about. If they say, I've got to get back to you, they probably haven't put in solar in your immediate area yet. And I'm always recommending to work with local folks. So that's just something to think about. A lot of people are asking me, okay, what are we talking about here in terms of math? I don't know what we're talking about. How big are the solar systems? How much energy can they produce? So this slide is helpful for you if you're looking at how much energy do I want to produce. You can assume that a kilowatt of solar can produce about 1,300 kilowatt hours per year. That's if it's on a ground mount system facing south. You can assume that it's going to be about 2 to 250 per watt installed, and that every kilowatt is going to take up about 100 square feet. So just good rough numbers for you to start thinking about things. If you want to look up exact places and orientation of where your solar is going to produce, you can go to pvwatts. Well, search for PV watts. It's actually a .gov site, so I'm not sure what the exact address is. That's PVWATTS. That's a tool that's produced by the National Renewable Energy Laboratories. It's very good. It's site specific to everybody's zip code, and you can put in just about any orientation for solar panels, and it'll tell you what that system will produce. Okay, so solar incentives. The big one is the solar tax credit. It is, the federal tax credit is 26% of the total cost. That is the cost of the panels, the racking, the installation, any of the wiring that's needed to hook that up to your system. It includes permitting and everything. So through the end of 2022, it is 26% of that total cost, no upper limit. It drops to 22% in the next year, and then it will drop to 10% for businesses after that, barring any other extensions. So that is a big one. It takes a big chunk out of it. And just to be clear that it is a credit. So that credit is a direct reduction of your actual paid bills. There is also an Iowa tax credit that was, in theory, approved through this year, but the state legislature did not renew or allocate any more dollars to this program. When they set that system up, said that we're only going to get $5 million in state tax credits out each year. Those dollars are already spoken for. So you can, in theory, as a business, apply for the state tax credit this year. But unless the legislature takes action very soon in the next session, when they meet next year, I would not count on those dollars at all. So they are set to be 11% and then to reduce to 5%. But I would probably run your biz numbers assuming that that's not going to happen. So really just thinking about the federal tax credits, I mentioned the state tax credits just as a possibility. The other thing, though, as far as benefits to all businesses and farms included, is that you can take depreciation. So you're allowed to take depreciation of the entire cost of the system less half the federal credit. So currently that's 87% as a business deduction. So a cost of doing business. You can take that over time. A lot of times people will straight line it over 5 or 7 years. But you are allowed to take it all in 1 year if you choose. So this, unlike the credit, is just a reduction in your income for the year. But if you take 80%, 80, 90% of that cost as a deduction, assuming you're in a 25% marginal tax bracket, this offsets about another 22% of system costs. So it is something to be looking into. It certainly can affect the payback of the thing, bring that down a few years. And, I'll just mention this, if you don't have upfront money to pay for solar, consider financing it. It's very possible that your principal and interest payments could be less expensive than your energy savings, especially if you have net metering, especially if you're taking that federal tax credit. So there is good solar financing out there. There's established loss, whatever the bankers are looking for, history, to look at financing solar. I know that I'm going to ask one question here just about solar, and that is that panels themselves are warranted for 20 to 25 years. One of the reasons that solar is electric is such a great thing, and compared to even other renewable energy, is that it doesn't have any moving parts. So the wind industry has gone to big wind towers, and utilities are managing fleets of those at a time. Small wind has pretty much been replaced by solar energy because it is providing electricity, right? You put those panels on your roof or in the ground somewhere. Make sure all the nuts are tightened up, and there shouldn't be any maintenance needed other than maybe occasional cleaning. But even then, you can wait till it rains, and it's going to not affect the power output to that system by all too much. So, Larry, Brian, do we have questions coming through in the chat? And
Well,
let me
first,
know
I'd
what
like
else I should do here.
to remind folks listening, go ahead and either unmute their mic and just ask the question, or type it into the chat box. Either way. Larry, did you have some questions as we were going through today? Excuse me, Brian.
Did I say Larry too?
Yeah, I did actually have a couple questions for you here, Joel. Great presentation. Really appreciate the information. So one of the questions I had was, get my headset working here. So you had mentioned the 3-phase motors on the vacuum pump, and then for the variable speed drive, and also variable speed drive on the milk pump. So is that milk pump motor, is that generally small enough you can just run that single phase? Or if you had 3-phase, would it make sense to use that for the milk pump as well?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm not sure on that. The milk pump motors are only 1, maybe 3 horsepower. I don't know if they have a power converter on them or not for 3-phase, but it costs a lot less, for a small motor to do that than some of them actually, I think, are actually converting to DC, and they're running a DC motor for that piece. So, sorry,
No,
I don't have the specifics for you.
Then another one I was thinking of during the presentation. So a lot of households are going to the on-demand type water heaters.
Sure.
Do you see many of those in dairy facilities, or are they still mostly using the tank style?
Oh, I'd say it's a pretty good mix. I really like the on-demand heaters when they were the first option that were considerably more efficient than the old tanks. You can get an on-demand water heater that is 95% efficient because they're actually, they're super efficient. They're condensing, but they can be kind of high maintenance, especially with hard water. So I have also seen a lot of folks put in condensing tank water heaters. And because they're not blasting that water with quite so much heat all at one time, I think that the maintenance on those probably seems like it's going to be a little bit less. So if it were me, that would probably be the route I would go. You can get tank water heaters that are also 95% efficient. And I just think that they're probably a little less temperamental than the on-demand ones are.
Great, thanks.
But I will say for actually any situation, it is easier when you're running that water through. If it's already 110 degrees, you're not going to use as much energy, and that can also help a little bit on the maintenance, even on those tankless units.
Okay, I've got a couple questions here. First, I'll mention to those folks listening, if you've got a question, go ahead and get it to us. Also, when we conclude, if you will go ahead and click on that short survey, we'd love to find out, what your thoughts were and help us gather information to make these programs better. Joel, you'd mentioned converting to LED lights. Are there any other options out there, or is LED absolutely the best?
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of different type of LEDs. So there's a lot of options out there as far as what you're looking at in terms of, but lighting is all going to go to LEDs, I think, for the foreseeable future. They make LEDs that one-to-one swap outs. So I mean, I mentioned those high bay lights that you can swap out old metal halide high bay fixtures, or even the fixed lamp fluorescent fixtures with. But they also make LED strip retrofit lamps that can fit in an existing. If you have a 2x4 fluorescent fixture that has T12 or T8 fluorescent lighting in it, it can be cheaper and faster to just swap out the lamps inside those fixtures than changing out the entire fixture. And there are incentives for both routes. But LED exists in all sorts of type of lights, from screw-in type fixtures or lamps to lamps that can go retrofit inside your fluorescent lamps, to fixtures that are meant to go inside and be retrofitted inside your fluorescent lamps, to just you know, pole mounted, wall mounted. You know, the wall packs are another good option. A lot of folks have security lights on the outside of their barns. LEDs are definitely a good option there as well. So LEDs come in all types of shapes and sizes and brightnesses, but LEDs is pretty much where everything is going from an efficiency standpoint.
Very good. Kind of shifting gears on you here. With the scrutiny all of agriculture is having, especially with water use, what's going to be the comment when people say, "Oh, you're using water to cool milk"? What do dairymen say to those folks?
Well, I have not yet encountered a farm that is dumping that water. I mean, it's water that they're using to clean or to give to livestock to drink. And so I think it's actually just, it's a great way, because you're using that water twice. That's water that would have, I mean, that's why I called it free cooling, because they are going to be pumping that water anyways, either for cleaning or for livestock use. And so you just want to make sure you have a tank that's big enough to hold on to whatever water you're pushing through after you're milking for, you know, your animals to use over the next 8 hours.
Okay, Brian, any other questions you have?
Yeah, I do have one final question. So you talked about the EQIP funding for doing, you know, energy efficiency upgrades, but what if you're a producer and you're building a new facility? Are there any opportunities there on the energy side? I know you can get EQIP funding for other things, but on the energy side, if you're putting these things in new, are there options for EQIP funding there?
No, EQIP is a replacement program. So you've got to have an existing energy use, and it's just how they score it. You know, they say, what I'm taking out on a piece of equipment and I'm putting in this new, more efficient piece of equipment. And so I'm getting scored on the energy savings from that swap. So EQIP is not eligible or available for new improvements, although REAP should be. Certainly if you are looking at moving ahead with things, I think that REAP is available for energy efficient practices. And I think that you just have to have someone be able to write you a report of saying, here's our standard piece of equipment, and here's our more efficient piece of equipment, and here's our marginal cost, and here's our savings from that result.
Very good. I'd like to go back. If you're considering these things, who's the first doorway you ought to go through? Let's make sure we make.
I think the first
aware.
people you should talk to is your folks at the NRCS office. You should be in there talking to them anyway on occasion, and they know the programs. They've got a good pulse on how much funding is available in each funding stream. Of course, you can give me an email or send me a call as well. USDA keeps a list of technical service providers that are serving any state, any county, and you'll find me on there, and you'll find others as well. But you can also get that list from your NRCS office. So I say, if you've got time, talk to your NRCS office first, because they like to know what's going on. They don't like to be surprised with an energy audit plopped on their desk. They like to know that you're thinking about making some upgrades. And so they'll be more helpful for you if you can involve them from the beginning of the process and they're gonna there to give advice and guidance along the way as well.
Joel, we sure appreciate the information you brought to us. A lot of good information. Brian, we appreciate your help on this. Folks, before you log off, if you could click on the survey and let us know information off of that, we'd sure appreciate it. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Brian. We'll look forward to visiting with everybody next month, third Wednesday of the month over the noon hour. Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks for having me, Fred.
Thanks, Joel.
Thank you, Brian.